The old man was lying motionless beside the highway, half covered in dust, while dozens of cars rushed past him as if he didn't exist. I almost drove by too. I was already late for work, my rent was overdue, and my life was falling apart. But something about the way his hand trembled in the cold morning air made me stop the car. I had no idea that picking up that stranger on the side of the road would change my life forever. Before we continue, if you believe that one act of kindness can change a person's destiny and that everyone deserves a second chance, please like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to Kindness Hub for more emotional stories that restore faith in humanity. My name is Rowan Mercer, and 2 years ago I was barely surviving. I worked as a delivery driver in a small town surrounded by rolling hills and endless fields. Every morning I woke before sunrise, drank cheap coffee, and drove hundreds of miles delivering packages to people whose lives seemed far more comfortable than mine. I lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a leaking roof. After my wife passed away from a sudden illness, I had become a different person. Grief had hollowed me out. I stopped talking to friends, stopped dreaming, and simply focused on getting through one day after another. That particular morning was unusually cold despite being spring. The sky was bright blue, and sunlight spilled across the empty road. I had just turned onto the old county highway when I noticed something near the shoulder. At first I thought it was a pile of blankets. Then I saw a hand move. I slowed down. An elderly man was lying beside the road, his gray suit covered in dirt. He looked exhausted, almost lifeless. There were no other cars stopped nearby, no ambulance, no police. Just him and the endless stretch of road. I hesitated. I couldn't afford to be late again. My boss had already warned me that one more mistake would cost me my job. But when I looked into the man's face, I saw fear and loneliness. It reminded me of my wife during her final days in the hospital, when she looked at me as if begging not to be left alone. I parked the van and ran toward him. The man was conscious but weak. His lips trembled, and his hands were ice cold. He looked like someone who had once lived a good life but had suddenly lost everything. I helped him sit up and offered him a bottle of water from my truck. He drank slowly, his eyes filling with tears. I called for an ambulance, but the nearest one was almost an hour away because of an accident in the next county. I couldn't leave him there. So I did something completely unexpected. I put the stranger in my van and drove him to the small medical clinic in town. The nurses immediately took him inside. I waited in the lobby for almost 2 hours. I kept checking my phone, knowing I would probably lose my job. Eventually, a nurse came out and told me the man was suffering from exhaustion and dehydration. He had been walking for miles. When I finally stepped into his room, he looked much better. His name was Cedric Holloway. There was something unusual about him. Even in his worn clothes, he carried himself with dignity. He spoke softly and thanked me repeatedly for saving him. I asked if he had any family. The question made him look away. He explained that he had spent the previous night in a motel after traveling from another city. Early that morning he decided to take a walk and became disoriented after feeling ill. He had no phone and no one nearby to call. I offered to drive him wherever he needed to go after he was discharged. He smiled and accepted. As we drove through town later that afternoon, he looked out the window like someone seeing the world for the first time. Then he asked me a question. He wanted to know why I had stopped to help him. I laughed softly because I honestly didn't know. Maybe it was because I understood loneliness, maybe it was because I knew how painful it felt when people looked the other way. For a long moment he said nothing, then he thanked me again. I dropped him off at a modest inn on the edge of town and assumed I would never see him again. I was wrong. 3 days later I lost my job. I arrived at work only to discover that my manager had replaced me. Being late that morning had been the final reason. I walked out carrying a cardboard box containing my few belongings. I remember sitting in my old car in the parking lot, feeling completely defeated. I had almost no savings left. I didn't know how I would pay rent. I didn't know what would happen next. As I sat there, my phone rang. The caller was someone I didn't recognize. It was Cedric. He somehow found my number through the clinic. He invited me to lunch. I almost refused because I was embarrassed by my situation. But I eventually agreed. We met at a small diner. As soon as he saw my face, he knew something was wrong. For the first time in months, I told someone the truth. I told him about losing my wife. I told him about my financial struggles. I told him how empty my life had become. Cedric listened carefully. When I finished, he looked at me with eyes filled with understanding. Then he told me something that shocked me. He wasn't an ordinary old man. Years earlier, he had built one of the largest furniture companies in the state. He had spent decades creating a successful business before retiring. I stared at him in disbelief. He didn't look like a wealthy businessman. He looked like a tired grandfather. Then his expression became sad. He explained that money had never protected him from loss. His wife had died years earlier, and his only son had cut ties with him after a bitter family argument. He had spent years alone. That morning on the highway, he had not only been physically exhausted. He had been emotionally exhausted too. He admitted that before I stopped my vehicle, he had almost given up on life entirely. Those words hit me hard. I suddenly realized that I hadn't only saved a stranger. I had saved a broken heart. For the next several weeks, Cedric and I kept in touch. He invited me to have coffee. We shared stories. We talked about grief, regret, and second chances. Little by little, the emptiness inside me began to fade. One afternoon he invited me to visit an old warehouse outside town. The building was enormous but abandoned. Inside were beautiful pieces of handcrafted furniture covered in dust. He explained that the warehouse had once belonged to his company. Then he asked if I would help him bring it back to life. I laughed because I knew nothing about furniture, but he didn't need an expert. He needed someone he trusted. At first I simply helped clean the building. Then I started learning. I repaired tables, polished chairs, and helped organize inventory. Weeks turned into months. The warehouse slowly transformed. For the first time since losing my wife, I woke up excited about the day ahead. I felt useful again. I felt alive. One evening Cedric handed me an old photograph. It showed him standing beside a young boy, his son. He confessed that despite his success, the greatest failure of his life had been losing his family. He wished he could make things right. That night I encouraged him to reach out. He seemed uncertain, but a few days later, he made the call. The reunion didn't happen immediately. There were tears, anger, and painful memories, yet little by little, the walls between father and son began to crumble. Months later, I watched Cedric hug his son for the first time in years. I had never seen him smile like that. Then something unexpected happened. Cedric decided to reopen the furniture company under a new name, and he asked me to become his business partner. I thought he was joking. I had been a delivery driver with no savings and no future, but he insisted. He said kindness had brought us together and that he trusted my heart more than my experience. The company started small. We hired local workers who had lost jobs. We restored old furniture and sold handmade pieces. Business grew faster than anyone expected. Within a year we had expanded across the region. I finally moved out of my tiny apartment and bought a modest home. I wasn't rich, but I had purpose again. I had hope. Most importantly, I had gained something I never expected. A family. Cedric became like the father I never had, and his son became one of my closest friends. Every holiday we gathered around a large table built with our own hands. Sometimes I still think about that morning on the highway. I think about how close I came to driving away. One small decision changed everything. A few minutes of kindness gave a lonely old man a reason to keep living and gave a grieving widower a new beginning. If this story has touched your heart so far, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Hub. Your support allows these stories of hope and kindness to reach people who may need them the most. And before this story ends, we have one special request. Please comment below. Kindness always comes back. Because it truly does. Today, whenever I drive along that same highway, I slow down near the place where I found Cedric. I look at the side of the road and remember the broken man lying there and the broken man sitting behind the steering wheel. Neither of us knew it then, but we were both waiting to be saved. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with flashing lights or grand speeches. Sometimes they appear on an ordinary sunny morning, on the side of a dusty road, disguised as a stranger who simply needs someone to stop. And sometimes, the life you save ends up saving your own. If you'd like, I can also